Hi, Angela Wolf here, owner of Angela Wolf Patterns and Online Academy. And we are back in my studio because of the travel restrictions, so welcome. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to sew a neckline on a knit top with a facing. So let's take a closer look. Here's a neckline. You can see this fabric is almost like a ponte knit, and the facing is two separate pieces, and it glides right inside of that top. No top stitching needed. It looks beautiful, so let's take a look. So here's my top. This again is kind of a ponte knit, light stretch. The first thing you do, so I'm going to lay this flat. You could do this when you cut your pattern as well. I'm just going to lay this flat, line up the shoulders, and I want to put one snip at the center back and one snip at the center front. Because we're trying to make a really nice V here, and this is the easiest way to do that. All right, so here's my front and back. You'll need your facing pieces. So here's my facing pieces. You can see you have to put interfacing on these. Press that. This is just fusible interfacing. It works great. I can throw the top in the wash and it stays nicely. So put fusible interfacing on your two pieces of facing. That's the back and the front. Here, I've already sewn together my shoulders here. And I've pressed the seam allowances open. And if you compare that to the top, I know this is a knit, and usually you have the seam maybe going just to the back. I pressed this open as well. This fabric doesn't fray, and by pressing this open, when this is attached together, it's less bulk, okay? So on this piece here, I'm going to do the same thing. Fold it in half, line up your shoulder seam, mark your center back, and mark your center front, just with just a snip. It'll give you a guide. The other thing I'm going to do is, because we're trying to make a V, and I left a little bit of a marking here, but you can see, just make that nice and straight. That's going to be my guide. You'll see what that's for in a second. So, all right, let's pin this to the top. Now, notice that I'm actually sewing the facing on before I sew the sleeves. It just makes it so much easier to maneuver around the sewing machine when it's like this. So I'll put one pin at the shoulder. And the other shoulder seam, you want to make sure those are lined up. And my snips at the back. You want to make sure that the fabric and the facing are equal. All right, let's go to the sewing machine. So here, just slide your fabric underneath. And I also have twill tape here. This is just 3/8 of an inch wide twill tape, which we'll be using to secure the neckline. But first, I like to attach the facing to the garment first. It just makes it more secure, and then I go back and attach the twill tape. You could do it all in one step though if you wanted. So I'm using contrasting thread. Actually, I'm going to start this way. Here we go. Then this edge will line up with the edge of my foot here. Okay, and I'm using a stitch length of 2.5. And you're going to stitch all the way around the neckline. Take care when you go around the shoulders to make sure that the seams are pressed open and they stay open when you sew over them. Okay, now when we get down to the bottom of where the V is going to be, you want to make sure it lines up on both sides. So the easiest way is to stitch down. So the edge of my fabric's lined up with my presser foot. I'm going to stitch right down to that line, or where my snip is, which is on the edge of this line. I made my line a little bit wide, so don't be confused on that. You want to stitch right to the bottom of where you think that V will be. Now, lift up your presser foot and just turn your entire piece of fabric. Line up the edge back with your foot, and then you're going to stitch up the other side. This is an easy way to make sure that both sides of your V match up. One's not more curved than the other. All right, I'm just going to check to make sure that my seam allowances are laying flat and I don't accidentally stitch one going one direction and one the other way. Get my pin out of there. and around. All right, so what I have so far, you can see here, is my stitch line. I'm using a dark pink so you can see it. And I've stitched all the way around the edge. Now I'm going to go back with twill tape. Now when I attach the twill tape, just be careful that the twill tape and your fabric on your neckline are equal. Now, if you're going to stitch, if you can't stitch directly on the line you just stitched, err towards the inside of the garment. You don't want to attach this to the seam allowance or you're going to end up cutting it off, which will do absolutely no good. All right, so I'm just going to stitch here. Hold your twill tape and then just every few inches move your hand. It's the easiest way to do that. Get these pins out of the way here. All right, on down. And again, what you want to make sure that you don't do is hold the twill tape too tight where the top is actually easing into the twill tape. Then you'll end up with puckers all over the place. Let's go down. You're going to watch again, right back to that V. And this is really narrow twill tape, so if you're stitching and you accidentally go off the twill tape, just go back and stitch over where you missed. Try to get my fabric out of the way so you can see here. All right, all the way down to this V. Again, you can see my marking. This is fabric marking, so it'll disappear. You could also use Tailor's chalk. Lift up. Now, you could stop and start with an entirely new piece of twill tape. I just use the same piece, slide my fabric over, because I'm going to snip into that twill tape later on. If you're using wider twill tape, then you might want to start over and just start with a new piece, because you want a V. We're not doing a circle, remember? Make sure your seam allowances are laying open when you get to the shoulder. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but I'm attaching the twill tape to the facing side, not the garment side. All right, let's see what that looks like. All right. So my twill tape is on the facing side. Now the next thing you're going to do with a sharp pair of scissors is you're going to cut this and angle your scissors like this. And you're going to trim right next to that twill tape. And the reason you're angling your scissors is I'm trimming the facing a little bit shorter in the seam allowance than the top. And I'm just going to do a little section here. You don't need to see the whole thing because I want to show you how to do this V. So again, angle your scissors. You can see I'm just angling just slightly. These are really sharp scissors. And so by angling my scissors, it's trimming that facing a little bit shorter, all in one step. All right? Now for your V right here, you're going to simply snip right to the edge of your stitching. See that? All right. Let's go back to the sewing machine. You're going to add some understitching. And I'm just going to do a little section here because you'll get the idea. So I'm using a darker thread so you can see it. And I'm stitching about 1/8 of an inch so on the facing, and I'm pushing the seam allowance towards the facing. So I'm securing the seam allowance to the facing. Here's the tip of my V right where my finger is. Lift that up. You could also mark that with chalk if you have any problem seeing it. All right, and you'll do this all the way around. So let's go up here and take a look. All right, so here's a close-up of what I just did. We sewed together the entire facing. We attached the twill tape trimmed off the seam allowance, and you want the seam allowance on the facing to be a little bit shorter than the garment. And then once you add the understitching, I haven't even pressed this yet, and look at how nicely this rolls to the inside of the garment. So this side hasn't been understitched yet, this has. So now from the right side, you will not see that facing at all. So take a look at this velvet top. Again, the facing, it just tucks right to the inside of the top, and that's how easy it is to add facing to a knit top.